Good afternoon. I'm Kwong Noi Shun, Dean of the Undergraduate Division in the College of Letters and Science. Welcome to the Berkeley Writers Awards series sponsored by the College Writing Program. The series, now in the 4th year, provides a forum for well-known writers on campus to discuss their writing process. And I'm pleased to introduce our two speakers, two writers, sitting on my right, Arlie and Adam Hochschild. Arlie Hochschild received her BA from Swarthmore and PhD from Berkeley, and is currently the professor of sociology at Berkeley. She is also the co-director of the Berkeley Center for Working Families and has been consulted by the White House on family-friendly policies in that capacity. She has been a major national influence on how we view working parents and has written several books, including, and I'm sure you know about some of these books, The Time Bind When Work Becomes Home and Home Becomes Work, that's in 1997. The Second Shift, Working Couples and the Revolution at Home, 1989. The Managed Heart, The Commercialization of Human Feeling, 1983. The Unexpected Community in 1973 and Colleen the Question Girl in 1969. Adam Hochschild received his BA from Harvard and is a lecturer in the Graduate School of Journalism. He has contributed articles to many magazines and has also been a commentator for National Public Radio. His books, which have received numerous awards, include King Leopold's Ghost, A Story of Greed, Terror, and Heroism in Colonial Africa, that's in 1998. The Unquiet Ghost, Russians Remember Stalin, that's in 1994. And also Half the Way Home, a memoir of father and son in 1986. Joining them today as interviewer is Maggie Sokolik, and also seated on my right, who received her PhD in applied linguistics from UCLA. She has been teaching writing since 1987 and is the author of several books on reading, writing, and American culture. She is currently working on a book on writing and technology for the University of Michigan Press. Now, Arlie and Adam will now start reading briefly from their writings, and then Maggie will put some, I hope, difficult questions to them. Okay, thank you.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here. See so many friends. We've been asked to read something short from our writing, and I thought I would read from the preface to The Second Shift. When I was 31, a moment occurred that crystallized the concern that drives this book. At the time, I was an assistant professor in the sociology department at the University of California, Berkeley, and the mother of a 3-month-old child. I wanted to nurse the baby and to continue to teach. Several arrangements were possible, but my solution was a pre-industrial one, to reintegrate the family into the workplace, which involved taking the baby, David, is now 30, and fighting the good fight, with me for office hours on the 4th floor of Barrows Hall. From 2 to 8 months, he was nearly the perfect guest. I made him a little box with blankets where he napped, which he did most of the time, and I brought along an infant seat from which he kept an eye on keychains, colored notebooks, earrings, and glasses. Sometimes waiting students took him out into the hall and passed him around. He became a conversation piece with shy students, and some returned to see him rather than me. I put up a fictitious name on the appointment list every 4 hours and fed him alone. The baby's presence was like a Rorschach test for people entering my office. Older men, undergraduate women, and a few younger men seemed to like him and the idea of his being there. In the next office, there was a 74-year-old distinguished emeritus professor, and it was our joke that he would stop by when he heard my son crying and say, shaking his head, "Beating the baby again, huh?" Textbook salesmen with briefcases and striped suits were generally shocked at the unprofessional gurgles and sometimes unprofessional odors from the box. Many graduate student women were put off, partly because babies were out of fashion in the early 1970s, and partly because they were afraid that I was deprofessionalizing myself, women, and symbolically them. I was afraid of that too. Before having David, I saw students all the time, took every committee assignment, worked evenings and nights writing articles, and had in this way accumulated a certain amount of departmental tolerance. I was calling on that tolerance now with the infant box, the gurgles, the disturbance to the dignity and sense of purpose of my department. My colleagues never seemed to talk about children. They talked to each other about research and about the department's ranking, still number 1 or slipping to number 2. I was just coming up for tenure, and it wasn't so easy to get, and I wanted at the same time to be as calm a mother for me, for my son, as my mother had been for me. And in some literal way, I had brought together family and work, but in a more basic way, doing so only made the contradictions between the demands of baby and career all the clearer. One day, a male graduate student came early for his appointment. The baby had slept longer than usual and hadn't been hungry at my appointed Barrows Hall time. I invited the student in. Since we had never met before, he introduced himself with extreme deference. He seemed acquainted with my work and intellectual tastes in the field, and as I am sometimes tempted to do, I responded to his deference by behaving more formally than usual. He began tentatively to elaborate his interests in sociology and to broach the subject of my serving on his PhD orals committee. He had the task of explaining to me that he was a clever student, trustworthy and obedient, but that academic fields were not organized as he wanted to study them, and of asking me whether he could study the collected work of Karl Marx under the rubric Sociology of the Family. In the course of this lengthy explanation, the baby began to cry. I slipped him a pacifier and continued to listen all the more intently. The student went on. The baby spat out the pacifier and began to wail. Trying to be as casual as I could, I began to feed him. At this point, he let out the strongest, most rebellious wail I had ever heard from this small person. The student uncrossed one leg and crossed the other and held a polite smile, coughing a bit as he waited for this little crisis to pass. I excused myself and got up to walk back and forth with the baby to calm him down. "I've never taken the baby here all day before," I remember saying. "It's just an experiment." "I have 2 children of my own," he said. "Only they're in Sweden. We're divorced, and I miss them a lot." We exchanged a human glance of mutual support, talked of our families more, and soon the baby calmed down. A month later, when the student signed up for a second appointment, he entered the office and sat down formally. As we were discussing last time, Professor Hochschild, nothing further was said about what had, for me, been an utterly traumatic little episode. Astonishingly, nothing had changed. I was still Professor Hochschild. He was still John. Something about power lived on, regardless. Part of me felt envious of the smooth choicelessness of my male colleagues who did not bring their children to Barrows Hall, but who knew their children were in loving hands. I sometimes felt this keenly when I met one of these men jogging on the track, and then met his wife taking their child to the YMCA Kinder Gym program. I felt it too when I saw wives drive up to the building in the evening in their station wagons, elbow on the window, 2 children in the back, waiting for a man briskly walking down the steps, briefcase in hand. It seemed a particularly pleasant moment of their day. It reminded me of those summer Friday evenings, always a great treat, when my older brother and I would pack into the back of our old Hudson, and my mother, with a picnic basket, would drive up from Bethesda to Washington, D.C. at 5 o'clock to meet my father, walking briskly down the steps of a government office building, briefcase in hand. We picnicked at the cherry basin surrounding the Jefferson Memorial, my parents sharing their day, and in that end-of-week mood, we came home. When I see similar scenes, something inside me rips in half, for I am neither and both, the brisk stepping carrier of a briefcase and the mother with the packed picnic supper. The university is still, and I believe still, designed for such men and their homes for such women. As I repeatedly heard career women in the second shift that I interviewed for the second shift say, what I really need is a wife. But maybe they don't need wives. Maybe they need careers basically redesigned to suit workers who also care for families. This redesign would be nothing short of a revolution.
I'm going to read a short article which was published in the Los Angeles Times Book Review a year or two ago, and I thought it was appropriate for today because it's about a place that Arlie and I have spent a lot of time in together, and it's also about something which surrounds us at this very moment, namely a collection of books. A year and a half ago, for the first time, some American high school and college students were issued electronic books instead of textbooks. The arrival of these handheld gadgets with computerized screens feels to me not like a milestone of technological progress, but like the first notes of a death knell. In a society in which relatively few people read books for pleasure to begin with, still fewer will do so if they do not encounter books, real books, as students. There are many reasons to love the old-fashioned paper book. The subtle differences in how different kinds of paper smell, for example, and that promising virginal crackle of the spine as you open a new hardcover for the first time. The sense of accomplishment as you look at the shelves of what you've read, and of humility as you look at the shelves of what you haven't. I've been feeling sad about the possible death of the book for an additional reason. What books tell us about the person who owns and loves them? In this way, books give a small measure of immortality, not just to writers, but also to readers. Each year, my wife and I spend time at what was once the summer house of her late parents, and the room where she works is lined with her father's books. He was a career Foreign Service officer, a staunch Cold War liberal, and a man who believed that the best of human virtues were incarnated in Puritan New England. His picture of the United States was far rosier than mine. Particularly during the Vietnam War, we argued furiously, although he was a good man, and eventually we made our peace. But whatever the limits of his worldview, what strikes me now is how much of it I can still see in the books on his shelves. They are a portrait of his mind. They're books about the various places where he served as a diplomat: Ghana, New Zealand, Israel, Tunisia. For each time he was sent to a new country, he read up on it enthusiastically, looking for upbeat parallels to the New England experience. There are books by the hundred about the United States, for the most part, a country where everything works as smoothly and as wondrously as the Founding Fathers planned. Their titles alone tell the tale. This glorious burden, this is the challenge, the first new nation, the discipline of power. Some of his books are from a phase when he read biographies and memoirs of the famous. No dissidents, no women, but many presidents, great writers, and Supreme Court justices. He was trying, he told me once, to figure out what were the early life experiences that made people into great men. Other books clearly represent less what he actually read than what he would like to have read. For books form portraits of our unfulfilled ambitions. An ancient leather-bound set of Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England, perhaps a graduation present for when he finished law school, a huge family Bible, Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and Emerson's Complete Writings. Finally, there is his beloved collection of books on New England, including the 795-page genealogical dictionary of Maine and New Hampshire, which I pull out every summer to try to imagine the mysterious controversy alluded to in its preface. This acknowledges the contributions to the volume made by one Charles Thornton Libby, who, quote, acted as a consultant in problems in which he was known to have a personal interest, but his deep-seated conviction that the book should not be published at all did not make for an entirely happy situation, unquote. The point is this: I can look around the room and see a landscape of my father-in-law's interests, quirks, and beliefs. Collections of books, large and small, transcend time. Sometimes the collection is as carefully preserved as the library of the great 17th century diarist Samuel Pepys, which still sits at Magdalen College, Cambridge, on the shelves that the naval official Pepys had built for him by dockyard carpenters. Sometimes it is just the shelf of books over a bed. How many times, as a guest in someone else's house, staying in the room of a son or daughter no longer at home, have you looked through a bookshelf for clues to the tastes and dreams of the person whose room this once was? Such voyeurism is not a forbidden one, but one to be celebrated. It is not just the writing of books that expresses who we are, but also the freedom to collect them, to arrange them, and to enjoy the collections of others. Once, a man who had recently been released from many years as a political prisoner in Pakistan was visiting our house. Sitting in our living room talking, at one point he paused, jumped up, and began running his hands over the books on our shelves. "You must excuse me," he apologized. "I have not been able to do this in years." Technology now lets us put an entire encyclopedia on a CD-ROM with movies and music as well. Eventually, I'm sure, we'll be able to get the contents of a Barnes & Noble superstore on a microchip. But when we're gone, will someone ever be able to look at the chips and discs we used and clearly see, as one can through a collection of books, some glimmer of the shapes of our souls? Thank you.
A very auspicious beginning. We're having a little bit of sound problem here, so I'll try to use my big teacher voice. I'd like to start by noting that in the acknowledgments for both of your books, you regularly thank each other, as well as your sons, for their help in the writing process. And so I was curious, what's life like in a two-writer household as opposed to a one-writer household?
Okay. Well, it's a great blessing. It's a blessing because we get to share the beginning, the middle, and the end stages of writing. And I would say that, what I personally remember are hikes up mountains, and it seems like the bottom of the mountain, it always starts with, well, I don't know really what I'm after here, and I'm a little confused, but it could be one of three things. And about middle way there, well, two of the things are eliminated, and about 3/4 of the way there, then the one thing you've singled out is turned into three things, and by the top, you kind of have it, and that we do that for each other.
You develop certain, every writer has certain quirks, and we both have the one of kind of constantly scribbling notes to ourselves on pieces of paper or around the house of ideas we get for things that we're writing, and if, in the middle of the night, I notice her up scribbling madly beside the bed, at least I know she's not writing a love letter to somebody. And the same goes the other way.
So what's a typical writing day or writing session like? I mean, separate offices, large working space, any sort of talismans or important bits of things you need around you to write?
Well, he works in a closet.
I work in a very small room, a little bit bigger than this chair, but not much. You know, all you need is a place to spread some books and papers, and
All the books are on CD-ROMs.
I don't know. I think people make much too much of the whole question. This is always the first question in Paris Review interviews with novelists and so forth. And it may be that for novelists, the whole matter of you know, staking out a special time in the day and a special blend of tea that you have to be drinking, and everything just has to be right, and you have to have no sounds distracting you, is important. But I think we've always found, you know, living pretty busy lives with children and teaching and whatnot and all kinds of other things going on, that the writing routine is you just seize the time whenever you can get it. And that's when during the day it gets done.
Same for me.
Okay. In The Unquiet Ghost, in the acknowledgments, you state, Adam, a red-penciled manuscript filled with crossed-out passages and question marks in the margins is the greatest gift a writer can receive. I'm sure there are many students here, and maybe even some published writers, who might beg to differ with that assessment. In what ways, or how did you come to appreciate that kind of editing?
I think I learned to appreciate that during the 7 or 8 years that I worked as an editor at Mother Jones magazine during the 1970s and early 1980s. There were 4 or 5 of us who edited the magazine at that time, more or less as sort of a committee. And every manuscript that came in for publication, including the ones that we wrote ourselves, and most of us were also writing for the magazine, got passed around to everybody else. They marked it up thoroughly and X'd things out and put those question marks in the margin, handed it back. Then you took everybody's comments, revised, did it again. And I remember a number of my pieces going through this process, you know, 3 or 4 times. And it's a wonderful thing, because you very quickly learn that you have a lot to learn from other people with good eyes who are reading what you write. Doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be, you know, professional writers, just that they're good, thoughtful readers. I used to find when I was younger, you know, when I was in my 20s, say, and I would give a manuscript of something I'd written to a friend to read, I was always secretly hoping that the answer would be, it's the greatest thing ever written, don't change a word. But I think I've gotten over that by now. And, you know, if you look in the acknowledgments of my books, as you evidently have, and Arlie's also, you know, there are a lot of people we press into service reading the things that we write. Because writing is a dialogue. And one of the nice things about the fact that it comes in waves and drafts is you get a chance to have that dialogue with somebody and see how it works, and then go back and change it. There are a lot of people who are in professions, you know, an architect, you put up a building, it doesn't work, you can't revise it, but a writer can.
I would say we edit each other's work a lot, and I think we do it slightly differently, too. From Adam, I usually get kind of the best of journalism. Well, this is a dull lead. You know, you have to start with a vignette, kind of, you know, grab the reader, and where's your storyline, and get rid of this academic jargon, and slash, and a lot of humor in the margins. I'm more likely to try and get him to push an argument further, and then further again, and well, so where are you going? And the implication is, sort of. So a little less hard on the language and more on that final point, I guess.
Have you ever thought about co-authoring or collaborating on a piece to combine those two?
Well, we actually did once. We went down to Santa Ana, California, when we were first married, and wanted to do an expose of the John Birch Society. So Adam got a job as a Fuller Brushman, and I worked in an American opinion bookstore and handing out American flags, and then we wrote about it together. But actually, we have slightly different minds and slightly, he's more the historian and I'm a little more sort of the psychologist, and so it works this way.
Cynthia Leave of Newsday said regarding the time bind and used the phrases trademark sensitivity, X-ray eye, and gift for engrossing portraits, shrewd observations, elegant analysis. And Adam also states that if you had conducted the interviews that he did, he's sure you would have gotten more information than he did. What's your approach to effective interviews, and what is the secret of getting that kind of information that really does make the portraits in your books so engrossing?
He's being modest, as usual. I don't think there is a secret, except that you really like the person you're talking to. You really like the person you're talking to, and that means that through all of the things that you may disagree with that person about, that you actually have a feeling for them. And then, although in graduate school you get taught to have these long questionnaires and so on, I actually, in my old age, think that all these questions are impediments to a person telling a story, and that if you sit down in front of a person, they have a story that they want to tell you, and all you have to do is permit them to tell you that story. But that involves dealing with your own anxiety about the story that they want to tell you.
It's interesting that you bring up the idea of story, because I think both of your books really rely on the stories to sort of tell the truth themselves, as opposed to sort of lengthy exposition. How do you balance those kind of two sometimes conflicting forces, especially in academic writing? The force to be, to do the exposition versus just the narration, the telling of stories?
I would say that actually being married to Adam has helped me get on the edge of academic life and actually not be plonk center to it. And he reminds me of the foolishness of academic fads, and that there's a real world out there, that there are real moral issues, and life is short. We should get down to it. So I think our life together has been such a gift to me, and that's how I get rid of that academic thing.
But about storytelling, I think most people are instinctively, there's some storytelling instinct that's born in all of us, and it tends to get bred out of you by the academic world and the having to write for a particular form, the form of academic journals or whatever. People who write the most incredibly dense and turgid writing in an academic journal are nonetheless capable, when they come home in the evening, of telling a bedtime story to a child, because that storytelling instinct is in all of us somewhere. And the thing is just to get rid of all those layers that tell you that you can't write the way you talk.
Yeah. Okay, so how do we do that? I mean, as writing teachers or as writers, how do we fight these sort of, what I think sometimes are evil forces at the university that prevent students from really exploring the idea of story in their writing?
Adam teaches a course on that.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of it has to do with we all tend to model ourselves on models that are sort of officially given to us. And in the academic world, the models that are officially given to you are those of the great scholars in your field, whatever it may be. Some of them may have extraordinary things to say. A few of them may actually say those things well, but many of them, may have things to say but say it badly, or not have something to say and say that badly too. But nonetheless, you model yourself on that kind of thing. I think one benefit for me was that I never went to graduate school. Arlie did go to graduate school, but miraculously managed to shed the training about how one conducts social science discourse. It's often there in your first drafts, but then we get rid of it a little further down the line. One thing I always tell my students at the journalism school is I think that there is just as much, if not more, to be learned about good storytelling by reading short stories and novels and putting the techniques used there to work in telling nonfiction stories. There are certain disciplines, history is one, I think, where the art of storytelling is sometimes not completely lost.
What I do is waste a lot of time doing one terrible first draft that is my homage to the academic fathers, a sort of a male thing. I feel, okay, this is what you want, here I'll do it. And then I burn it. It's like this sacrificial offering, and it has no use whatever, except to absolve me of guilt so that I can then tell a story.
So thinking about other writing practices, in Half the Way Home you mention a journal that you kept, and I'm wondering if either of you continue to keep journals now that you're much busier people probably than previously.
I do very sporadically, although I think I'm much more likely feeling life is so short somehow that if I have an experience that is memorable, I try to think how I can work it into some published piece of writing in some fashion, rather than writing it up in a journal first. And I think this is something we've talked about, that we both often find that being in unfamiliar surroundings, living in a foreign country, which we've done on both of Arlie's last two sabbaticals, somehow increases your awareness of things around you. And I know it makes me write much, much more in the journal that I do keep. And you found that.
Same here. I don't keep a daily journal, but when we went to what was then the Soviet Union in the early 90s, when Adam was doing his book on Stalin, I kept a journal. And then 3 years ago, when we were Fulbright scholars in Kerala, India, I kept a journal. But when I come back here, it gets lost.
Sort of related to that, some of the students here may have read an excerpt about journal keeping by some kind of lesser popular people that have kept journals, namely some of the people at the camps in Russia that you wrote about. And for those who haven't read it, I was wondering if you'd like to make some comments about what compels people who may not be doing the most honorable things to keep journals about that.
Oh, this is the, I know the piece you're referring to. It was published in the New York Times a year or two ago on the occasion when they were able to indict a number of former officials of the death squads in Guatemala, because one of the people carrying out these disappearances and executions and so on had kept a very detailed diary. And that raised the question of why do people, often doing really horrible things, feel compelled to write it down? And the same was true, many other times and places in history, under the Soviets, under the Nazis, under the colonial regime in the Congo that I wrote about in my last book. People carrying out mass murder of various sorts kept diaries there too. I think it goes back to what Arlie was saying before, that everybody wants to tell their story. Even people doing things that we would consider completely horrible. And you know, if you can find a way of getting people to tell you their story, people very often tell you much, much more than they are aware that they are telling.
I remember the time when we were in Russia, we went to a Karaganda, which was a former, it's like Auschwitz for the Russians. And Adam was on the trail of a former commandant who had headed up a camp where people were being worked to death in coal mines. And we went out to visit this commandant. And, but we went in a van that had the guide that was with us, and the guide's a little girl, and then there was a historian of the small town and his son, and this huge group of people were going for this event of Adam's trying to get this commandant to tell his story. So how could this happen? So my job was to keep the crowd away so Adam could be with the commandant and get him to talk. It didn't work because all of this crowd of people kind of were finally around the table, and the commandant was drinking vodka and told his story anyway.
Well, he had more of an audience. Everyone wants to tell their story. This is what you know, Catholic priests know. It's what police detectives know. You know, you just have to get somebody talking, and they will tell it all.
The vodka helped.
Yeah.
Both of you, in fact, both of you, I think, address really important social and political issues in your books. And just sort of want to do a little word association, and that is activism and writing, and sort of what's in between those things, or in what way is writing an essential building block in activism, or is it not, in fact?
It is. It's necessary but not sufficient. Actually, our breakfast conversation was about what's preventing the activism today as Bush dismantles the redistributive mechanism of government as we know it and creates a plutocracy. And here at Berkeley, California, which I take to be the center of the moral universe, I don't understand why Sproul Hall doesn't have 2,000 people in it every day. And we were just talking about what's gone wrong. Why have progressive forces kind of gotten stuck like a deer in front of headlights? I mean, have we become consumers of political action instead of producers of political action? And why are rates of activism down? And what could we as writers do? How do we get between writing to activism? I don't have an answer, but I think it's the question.
I mean, I think the activists are the real heroes in the end, the people who do something to change the state of the world. Part of the problem now, I think, is that you know, there's been a sort of age-old connection that is the basis of all movements for human rights in the last couple of hundred years, the basis of investigative journalism, the idea that if you expose the evils, if you get the information out there, people will then act upon it. Well, the problem now is that we're sort of drenched in information from all sides. For people who really want to find out you know, the hidden truth about what's going on in some part of the world or whatever, it's not hidden any longer. It's there. There's a website about it. There's journals about it. You can get all the information you want. And making that leap from giving verbal or photographic pictures of atrocities or horrible things being done somewhere to making people want to act on it is something that seems to be harder to do now than it used to be. And I'm not sure how one bridges that gap. I think it's a huge problem, and it's one that only dedicated activists can solve.
Well, I'll tell you a little story just to get into. I'd like to get into the sort of mindset of writing a book like King Leopold's Ghost. I read King Leopold's Ghost holed up in an apartment in Amsterdam midwinter. The sun rises at 11 and sets at 3:30, and it was horribly cold this winter. And sort of, in the midst of the territory, where I think a lot of these evils were perpetrated. And one can imagine, as I read it, it was quite a kind of dark and dreary experience in many ways, although, of course, a wonderful book. I'm wondering what kind of mindset or psychology happens to you as a writer as you sort of enter these worlds, and actually for both of you.
Well, I think I'm the one that writes about the gloomier worlds, although who's to say whether the American family is necessarily a more cheerful world than that of some of these other things. I don't know, for myself, and I've done one book on apartheid South Africa, and one on Stalin-era Soviet Union, and one on the tremendous slaughter that took place in King Leopold's conquest of the Congo. I find, even though these are gloomy subjects, in a sense, that it may be just as a matter of my own egotism or something, the satisfaction of being able to get it onto paper, for me, outweighs the pain of the situation that I'm writing about. And especially in this last story about King Leopold's Congo was this true, because not only is the book the story of the tremendous devastation of the conquest of the Congo and the millions of people who lost their lives, but there was also an extraordinary human rights movement, the first great international human rights movement of the 20th century, with some wonderful, wonderful people in it that rose up to protest against all this and made it into a huge scandal, which it had not been considered before. And there is an inspiration and excitement that I always find in meeting people I can admire, who I feel sort of close to in some sort of ethical or moral sense, even though they lived 100 years ago, spoke in a different style or whatever. And I felt a great satisfaction in being able to get their story onto paper. And it's a story that had been really, it was very well known 100 years ago. It had been completely forgotten almost since that time. And the records were all there, and I did almost all my research in this very building.
I'll ask you the same question, although, some might think that it's a less gloomy subject. In fact, I'm not sure it is either. Certainly in the time bind, not a rosy picture. So how does immersing yourself in that culture, which it seems like you surely did, affect you sort of emotionally and as a writer?
Well, what I find myself doing is listening to people's stories, and sometimes people know how sad their story is, and then I feel sad with them. And sometimes they don't know how sad their story is, and then I'm sad talking it over with Adam more privately. But I guess, like Adam, I feel that ultimately I have optimism of the will. And feel that that we can turn things around, and that it's better to be a truth teller, to say it like you see it, even if that's not a popular thing to do, with the idea of that what problems you have uncovered can be resolved.
But you must also feel the satisfaction, though, of knowing that the very questions that you ask people make them think about things that they've never thought about before, because we've seen that in people that you've interviewed.
Yeah, people say that.
I want to go back to some kind of more specifically writing type questions. You both have really different upbringings, as I've read in some interviews with you and in some of your writing. But I sort of see, I think, how those point to specific areas in writing. But how do you see your upbringings influencing the writer you eventually became?
I don't know how different. In some ways, yes, but in some ways, no. We see the world through the same pair of glasses, I think. So whatever differences in upbringing there were, that had that same result.
You had a lot of time in other countries, that probably.
Yeah, I grew up in a number of different countries, and I think for me, it was the experience of two things. One is being the oddball in any particular situation. I was, for example, the only American on the playground when I was 12 years old in a Scottish Presbyterian mission school in Jaffa, Israel, when my father was posted there. And so everyone else was speaking Hebrew, and I was trying to learn the game of machanim really quick. How do I fit in here? So, be there for a while and then posted somewhere else, and you were the oddball again. So it was a terrific introduction to sociology. I think you have to be an oddball and get used to really seeing that it's important to figure out how groups work, because you don't really fit any particular group that you're with. I think that was one thing. I think also that growing up, I've just come recently to be more in touch with this. I think my mother was quite a depressed person, and that it became very important to me to learn how to read her emotions and lift her up somehow, so that she would be someone I could identify with that wasn't sad. So I think those two experiences both made me quite an insecure person, but it gave me the feeling that if I could just figure this thing out, I could fix it. Maybe wrong about that, but.
Well, I think for me it was a combination of several things coming together that made me want to approach the world through writing. One very obvious one, which I feel increasingly grateful for the older I get, is that I grew up in a house full of books with parents who read them to me, who loved them, who collected them, who believed that books were a source of wisdom, a source of understanding the world, that there was something, important about them. And so I had the habit of reading from a very early age. And then I was lucky as a teenager to be exposed to other parts of the world. My father was a businessman who did business in Africa, who made what may have been the mistake of taking me there on a business trip with him when I was still a teenager, and I began to realize that there was a connection between African miners working in very hot, damp, dangerous conditions far under the earth and the very comfortable life that we lived at home. And that made me start asking questions. I think when you're taken outside of your normal circumstances and put somewhere very different, it forces you in the end, when you come back home, to look at yourself a little bit differently. And that's an experience that we both had when we were young that has helped a lot. And I think it's one reason why we've continued to enjoy going to other parts of the world and seeing what questions that they raise about ourselves when we come back.
So you mentioned books. Who Who are you reading now? Who's on the nightstand right now?
Well, we're in a little readers group, and we're reading George Eliot's Middlemarch at the moment. He's 2 chapters ahead.
Whose writing do you admire? Who's influenced you, either directly or indirectly as a writer?
Now, let's see. I last summer got into William Grader's One World Ready or Not, which is about the history of globalization. And it's a very scary, nightmarish book, but I respect greatly how he's looking the devil in the eye and kind of, I think, spelling out the system, that describing the system from a progressive point of view that we're part of, and the full reach and implications of globalization. I very much got into that. I like the writing very much of Barbara Ehrenreich. I'm co-editing a book on women and globalization with her at the moment, and great admirer of hers.
Well, if one is allowed to claim indirect influences, and I think that was in your question, I'll go for Tolstoy and Shakespeare and so forth. But of people writing today, I tell you one writer I admire a lot who is remarkably little known in this country is a Polish writer named Ryszard Kapuscinski. I've never met anybody who's read him who didn't immediately nod and say yes, but far too few people have read him. And perhaps I'm partly interested in him because he came to his very unusual style of writing about the world as a journalist, and under very strange circumstances. He was the the roving third world correspondent for the Polish press agency for many years. This was during the period of communist rule in Poland, which meant that he went all over Africa, Latin America, Asia, filing dispatches in this terribly constrained format that wire service reporters have to use. But when he came home, he wrote books. And because he was writing for an audience in Poland at a time when Poland was still very much a Soviet satellite and you couldn't talk about the important things directly, all of his books are allegorical. And he did,
he doesn't use a notebook, right?
Right. He's extremely, although people refer to him as a journalist, he doesn't use a notebook when he works. He's said in interviews, and you'll be reading a book and he's giving you a very detailed description of being in a car with other journalists and they approach a roadblock, and then suddenly you're inside the head of the soldier in the roadblock listening to a monologue going on in his head or a monologue going on in the head of the Shah of Iran or whatever. All of his books are about the moment, or all his best books are about the moment of collapse of a great empire. Book about Iran, the fall of Haile Selassie in Ethiopia, the withdrawal of the Portuguese from Angola, and of course people in Poland knew what empire he really wanted to have collapse. But these books have a wonderful sort of magical force because of the political passion behind them, brought together with a great literary skill. And I actually think that now that he no longer has to write in allegory because that communism is over in Eastern Europe, his writing has become a little bit less interesting. But he's someone whom I admire greatly.
And you called him, I think, a journalist who applies the technique of magical realism, sort of a magical realism journalism.
Magical journalism.
Magical
yeah.
journalism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of those kinds of nuts and bolts of reporting and interviewing, I mean, what kinds of tools do you use? Are you tape recorder people, notebook people, take the laptop with you to write it up immediately? How do you approach those very practical kinds of issues?
Well, I take a tape recorder wherever I go and use it. First, I'll put it on the table and then I'll explain that this is something I like to use and is that okay? And if there's a child in the room, they play with it and I talk with the child. So you make the tape recorder a character in the room. You don't slip it in on them. You just kind of get them used to it and then I tape it, and there may be a lot of discursive kind of wandering in this interview that's off the topic, but that's also on the tape recorder. And then when I get in the car afterwards, I'll drive a certain distance and then stop, and then I have a yellow pad and I write down my impressions and kind of interview the house. What was the house telling me? What was the pathway? How did I feel with this person? Was I at ease? Was I not? If not, why not? And the dog. And as if you're sort of really interviewing everything. So I write those notes down and then stick them in a manila envelope with the transcription. So I go about.
I use a tape recorder too. I think they're great inventions. Because it frees you to notice other things. The tape is running, it's recording what the person is saying, you can be scribbling notes, they may think that you're also taking notes on what they're saying, but in fact I'm looking at what the books are on the shelves and what the decoration in the room is and so on. So it's a tool that's a very useful tool that gives you a chance to make freer use of the most useful tools, which are your own eyes and the things that you can notice with them. But I can never get people to talk the way that Arlie does. She just has to look deep into their eyes and they begin saying all sorts of things, and they always end up saying, well, for some reason I've never told this to anybody before. But
that's my biggest flatterer. What Adam did in Russia was interview people in Russian. He speaks Russian, but some people speak Russian very rapidly, and he couldn't catch all that they said. So going back to this tape recorder is a valuable tool. He would set the tape recorder going and then ask a question, and this flow of Russian comes back. He couldn't quite grasp it, so his next question was, well, tell me a little more about that. So another 10 minutes comes on, oh, that's very interesting, a little bit more. And then finally we got a transcriptionist who helped us with the translation, and he hauled in the fish.
She was able to transcribe it directly into English.
Yeah.
And so that was enormously useful, because sometimes, I don't know if anybody here has ever tried to study Russian, but it's a very difficult language. And I never knew when I went to interview somebody whether I would be able to understand 90 or 100% of what they were telling me, or only 50%. And it would always be somewhere in between there. But if I had it on tape and then could get it transcribed into English, later on I would know what they'd really been telling me.
But also, I remember one time on a train, we were traveling with a husband and wife who were farmers on a kolkhoz, a collective farm, and they didn't speak any English, and we were relying on Adam's Russian. And Adam would say, could you speak a little more slowly? And the guy would speak a little more loudly. So
they'd never met foreigners before.
He thought that we were deaf. So it was quite an adventure. Yeah.
So then you gather all of this and you get it home. What's next? Computers, typewriters, combination of those things, and if computer, how do you think that's changed your writing process from back in the old Royal typewriter days?
Well, I always do my sacrificial offering. I hope I get off of this and get over it and just do a good first draft next time. But I seem to need to bow to this academic God. And I do that by computer. And then I do my real draft longhand by pencil on yellow paper.
Most remarkable thing to watch, because most people, you know, they'll write something out by longhand first and then put it into a computer. But she writes it on the computer, then starts cutting it up with scissors and Scotch tape and so forth. And but it works. I do it all on the computer, and I do find computers a useful tool. My theory about writing is this: that people have always, any piece of writing that works has many, many drafts to it. In the old days when
It's quite right.
Amen.
Okay.
In the old days when writing tools were expensive and scarce, you know, you had to write with a quill pen on parchment, you did all the drafts in your head. And it's said that Shakespeare wrote only one draft. Well, in the sense of putting things down on paper or on parchment or whatever, I'm sure that was true, but I'm sure he went through many drafts in his head. These days, the computer makes it easy to have, you don't even have a distinction between drafts because you're sort of changing things on the screen. In the end, I'm not sure how much difference it makes, because you can look at enormously productive writers from the old pen and ink days. You know, Balzac wrote 150 novels or something and died at the age of 49, and did it just with pen and ink, and, you know, jumping out the window to avoid creditors and so on at the same time. So, but I think computers just put all of the drafts there in this one machine. And I do think it's a useful tool, especially for people who are doing research-based writing, as I'm doing at the moment, where I'm gathering a lot of information. As I get it, I can sort of plug it into the right part of the right chapter in the book, and then worry about sort of smoothing it all out and making it sound good and rearranging it for storytelling purposes later.
And the last thing he does is to read it aloud. Read it aloud. And I've taken to doing that too. I think it's a great thing, because if you fade out on a paragraph, you think, oh, this is boring. Well, what's it doing there? You know? Or if something is reading in a kind of a lumpy way and you've lost your impact, you need to get rid of the lumps. And you tell that by actually reading it aloud in a room by yourself. Just read it aloud. Does it read impactfully or not? So sometimes when I hear a voice, I think he's talking to somebody on the telephone. He's just reading it aloud to himself.
Just a short quotation here. In The Mirror at Midnight, Adam states that the advice every writer needs to hear is, "You're not finished yet," along with the reasons behind it. What other advice, and since we're getting near the time when we probably should take some questions, but what other advice do you think you could offer the writers in this room? What do they need to hear?
Well, I would say one thing that is really important to do is, when you're reading something that pleases you, delights you, moves you, whether it's a novel, a poem, an article in the newspaper, but something just strikes you as being really well written, and you wish, you know, God, I wish I could write something like that. Stop, reread it, take it apart, analyze it, draw a diagram of it, try to get behind the scenes and figure out how the writer managed to put this together to make it have that effect on you.
In other words, demystify it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right. I would say also, in the first stage of writing, don't be hard on yourself. Just get the story out. This is what I tell my students time and time again. Don't overjudge yourself on that first draft. Just get the story out. Just say what you have to say. Use yourself as an instrument. Listen to your own reactions to the world and get it out on paper. then go for a walk, take a break, come back, and then be hard on yourself. Then show no mercy. Then actually take it as a gift, a tough love gift, when someone gives you major surgery advice. And then actually just tenacity becomes very handy. And then don't let go of it till you really love it. Gets funner and funner the closer to that stage you are.
But first drafts are always the hardest.
Yeah.
I'm going to squeeze in another question before we open it up. What point do you think you sort of looked at yourself and said, aha, now I'm a writer? This is the turning point. Or was it just a sort of evolution?
For me, it was definitely an evolution. And I remember as a graduate student feeling foolish in taking out a manila envelope with, a manila folder and putting in it the idea of an article. And thinking, oh, this is pretentious of me, be a writer. And then I remember Adam saying, no, that's great. Go for it, that's great. Here's some more manila folders. I think it was at that point.
Well, I don't know. We've both always been doing it all our adult lives, and encouraging each other. But we've been lucky to be in fields and jobs where that is what we could do.
And even before that, I think as children, I remember writing a children's story in grade school. It was about Colleen, the question girl.
The early version of what was later published, yeah.
And I remember the principal paraded me around to the principal of this, I guess it was 5th grade class, paraded me around, and I got to read my funny story about a little girl trying to get her father's attention. And I remember I would always break down and giggle at it myself, so it was... I guess that was the first try I had at writing.
Okay.
Do you literally burn the
No, I don't. I don't literally. I don't. No, I hold on to them as a sign of the struggle.
And do you refer to that first draft?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
What I do is cut 2, I've taken a break, I'm coming back, and I look at it with a cold eye of a new day and go through it. Trash can, trash can, trash can. Cool idea, great. I'll take that trash can, trash can, trash can. Wonderful material, but it doesn't go there. Trash can, trash can, trash can. Trash can, trash can, trash can, trash can. Wonderful, I'm going to start with this. It's just like that. But you're really hard on yourself, but there are some pearls there, some great ideas, but they're just kind of lost and need to start again. No, I don't burn it.
I'm just curious to your, you say, it seems to be an epidemic condition. I'm just curious as to your view.
Well, I think it has to do with not just how the academic world is structured, but with the fact that in Shakespeare's time, writers had to directly find an audience if they wanted to be, make a living as writers. You had to write plays which somebody would want to produce and where people would want to come to the performance. If you wrote poetry, it was the same thing. People either bought your poetry broadsides or they didn't. These days, with so much writing that's done within the academy, people are no longer writing for an audience. They're writing for a small group of fellow scholars. And then there are all sorts of other things that come into play within that. There is the idea in most academic fields that when you start out, you do your PhD thesis, you have to find something to study that hasn't been studied before. or that hasn't been studied sufficiently before, or it's some angle that hasn't been studied before. Well, that's a very limiting thing. People get a habit, of doing this when they write that thesis that then is carried on into their later work. And this is something, sometimes it is useful to study something that hasn't been studied before, but it may be that it hasn't been studied before because it isn't worth studying. Or it may be that the thing to do is not to find something that hasn't been studied before, but find something that people have written about before, but write about it better. And I am struck again and again by the fact that the grace of a writer's ability to tell a story has so little connection with the worth of the substance that they're telling. I'm working mainly in history right now, and there are some great historians in terms of the stuff that they dig up, the things they've found that nobody's found before, but who write so turgidly. And I really think a lot of this has to do with the fact that so much scholarship today are people writing for a small group of fellow scholars. And that puts a premium not on telling stories in a way that people are going to listen to them, emotionally respond to them, but rather, nailing somebody for something that he got wrong in the footnote of his last book, or finding some angle that nobody else has pinned down, or some set of documents that nobody else has got before. And it doesn't relate to storytelling.
Yeah. There's another reason I think that we're eliminating grace in writing in academic life, and that is, I think, this post-structuralist, postmodern focus on discourse, that you can only talk about discourse and everything else you can't. And it's almost like this little paranoid fad that's taken over English, and it's made a stronghold in anthropology. It's making headway in sociology. And I had a conversation with someone who was saying, oh, now that post-structuralism is here, we can't go back. She said, she was almost afraid. We can't go back to storytelling, to heart, to empathy. And I thought, what weirdness has taken us over here? And these are the good guys that have important stories to tell, who were afraid that they will be beheaded in some review of their book. And they're probably right. That they will be beheaded by some post-structuralist who's doing the review. And so that we're all the captive of these small kind of academic audiences with blocked mobility who are taking their aggression out on people who tell moving stories. And we got to do something about that, because we're Berkeley, we're the good guys, we're the ones that care with some sense of civic responsibility. And I think it's actually a moral duty to write clearly and for a larger group.
Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on that statement, if you would. But then you are caught with your peers who could be reviewing your manuscript, who probably have had to make their own compromises with that question. So, how do you scratch the edge at this moment?
Good point. Okay. Yeah. How do you have your cake and eat it too? You want tenure. You want an academic job, and you want to write gracefully on issues of importance. And I think it's a wonderful question. It's an important question. I think writing for double audiences and breakthrough books is possible. And what I would do is say the same thing in two ways. So feed the lion, do an article for like the American Journal of Sociology in my field, but then write a feelingful book on the same subject, making the same points in a more straight across way. So do it twice in different in different languages so that the academics feel spoken to. You might disagree with this, but anyway, it's how I made it. So they feel spoken to, but that you won't find quite the opposition you expect if you break out and speak clearly to a general audience.
I think sometimes you can do both things in the same book. In my last book, King Leopold's Ghost, I tried to tell the story for a general audience who were, not Africa scholars or specialists, but I knew that, the Africa scholars would be out there reading it and looking for mistakes and so forth. So, and plus just on general principles, because this particular Holocaust is one that a lot of people in Europe have worked very hard to deny ever happened. I wanted to have everything documented, so I had a very fat array of footnotes.
800, wasn't it? 800 footnotes?
900 something footnotes. They're all in the back of the book, but to not interfere with the flow, I didn't have footnote numbers in the text. Instead, they're the kind of notes where it's, the key words are repeated in quotes and so on. Sure enough, in some academic journal, somebody griped the footnotes weren't numbered. But nonetheless, they're there, and that's where you can put the material that's disputing somebody else's account and pointing out where someone missed something and, correcting somebody else's error. You can put that all there. And you can show the sources it's all come from. And, 90% of the people who read the book won't look at the notes and bibliography, but, the scholars in the field can find what they want there.
I don't know if this is really the end of it or just my impression that I was left with is that there really wasn't a resolution to this issue of the time and families. And so I wondered if, what you think is the future of this and what you're working on now related to that you're continuing on.
Well, the end of the time buying calls for a movement for the to shorten the work week, right? There's a political punchline. And I don't see it happen. George Bush, of course, is working his 4-day week. No, Cheney is doing the damage. The job is ahead of us. The job is ahead of us. We are, as I argued in the second shift, in a stalled revolution, and we've fought for a lot of policy reforms, and we haven't gotten there yet. And I think what we need is a new alliance of feminists with child advocates, with labor unions, and nonprofits to put forward a progressive agenda that I think does include the shorter work week. If Norway can do it, if Sweden can do it, Germany can do it, why can't we do it?
Okay, thanks everyone. Thank you especially.